I think probably the biggest detriment sometimes to some of these issues that are caused where people lose their faith is because they never really dug that deep in the first place, right? There's a parable that talks about this and the shallow, the roots and whatnot, and the sun came out. Well, that sun that comes out is really a picture of someone who goes to church. They went to Sunday school. They know the Bible stories. They can quote some scripture. They read their Bible, but they can't answer the hard questions. And so when someone else comes through, like an atheist or maybe an agnostic or someone who like has these deeper questions, and week 1 we covered some of the traditional. Week 2, we covered a little more of the emotional, and then today we're going to cover some more from like an archaeological and the text of the documents perspective. And we don't have the answer, and what can happen is we can get to this point where it can start to erode our faith a little bit. Just like the sun withered the sapling that was coming up, we can start to, and I've been there, like I've heard things, I'm like, oh, that's true. Let me go see. And more often than not, sometimes there's a logical answer. Sometimes they're just wrong. But if we don't study, the Bible talks about study to show ourselves approved. If we don't do that and we just we hear these things and there's this kind of general consensus in society that like this stuff is true. And so we just hear things like, well, the Bible's full of a bunch of inconsistencies and there's errors and stuff. And we're like, oh yeah, that does make it. And we don't necessarily go and look and see, well, let me see is that true? Like, is there an answer? Or is that just an outright lie? Is that something that they thought but then is outdated? And I talked about Rhett and Link last week, and one of Rhett's big things that he talked about, and I didn't really go into this in the message because it kind of was a little too similar to some of the stuff we're doing today, excuse me, was he went into a lot of like the archaeology stuff, and he talked a lot about like, there's all these Bible stories, and we have like these huge like cataclysmic events, or we have these huge groups of people like the Israelites and the Amalekites and the Amalekite, and like there's no historical or archaeological evidence for these things. So if this stuff isn't true, then how do you expect us to believe like the other stuff? And really a lot of it comes down to, well, let me just say up front, archaeology, let's be honest, that's really the last 100 years or so. So for the majority of Christianity, we've had absolutely zero archaeological proof to back up anything in the Bible because it's a relatively new art. In fact, there's a reason why Indiana Jones is set like in the 40s, is because that's kind of when it was big. And I know it went back, even before that. But we didn't have a lot of archaeology type. It just wasn't as prominent. We didn't have, I know there was some stuff you could say, well, actually, that's why King Xerxes, because his dad was doing, I get it, it's been around. But it's really the last 100 years that we've been able to really find a lot of these things and try to prove whether or not this stuff exists. So it's been easy in the beginning for people to say, well, archaeologists say there's no proof of the Bible. I'm like, well, give them a minute, okay? And so we've been finding more and more and more. And the reason I think some of this stuff is important is just to know is because it can be a shock when you find out some things. If you just grow up in church your whole life, you can kind of have some like preconceived ideas. And we start to find out some things that can rattle our faith because we only hear the negative side. So we hear things like, well, that like there's no original copies of the original text left, right? You're like, wait, what? There's not, like, hasn't the Bible just existed forever? Well, no, if we logically think about it, like the disciples didn't have it. Wait, Jesus didn't preach from a Bible? What? And we kind of just start to like have this idea in our head, and we begin to hear these things, stuff like, well, did you know that? And they say, and we're like, no, I didn't know. That can't be true. And they're like, actually, it wasn't. The Bible hasn't just been the way it was forever. In fact, it was just a group of men who got together and voted on what books should be in and other. And so really, you can't really count it all. It's just a bunch of men coming together and deciding what is in there. And if we don't actually know the answer to some of these things, it can kind of erode our faith a little bit. And that is why I feel it's so important. And as we are going to be going into the Gideon series, we're going to really be building your faith up in that series. I think it's important to know, because what happens as soon as you start to step out in faith, the enemy will start to try to dissolve it. And so if we go into this Gideon series, underdog, and we're getting our faith built up, and yes, it's exciting, I want to do things from God, and we start getting hit by these, online articles or a YouTube video or like a TikTok of someone being like, the Bible actually, blah, blah, blah. And we're like, oh, really? Oh, man. Well, I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't be believing for healing if I don't even know if the Bible's actually accurate. Or what if it's mostly accurate, but that part that I was leaning on, maybe that part's a little inaccurate, and it can erode our faith. So I want to get into a couple things. I'm just going to hit a couple right off just to prove the point that there are things that at one point seemed like the Bible is inaccurate, and then they realized later, hey, we actually were wrong. The Bible is right. So just a couple off to start us off. One criticism was that the Bible in Genesis talks about Abraham and their camels. Of all things, let's argue about camels. But that was one evidence, quote unquote evidence, of why the Bible can't be accurate, because people weren't hadn't domesticated in that region camels and using them until however many, like 1,000 years later, whatever it is. And so people said, hey, that's proof that the Bible's not actually true because it says he's using camels. And so this is proof. And they keep trying to say, hey, a lot of this stuff was written hundreds or thousands of years later, and it's legend. So even if there was a grain of truth, it can't be trusted because there's so much legend that has been put in. And they say that's proof, because if they were actually there writing it in the modern time, they would have known that there were no domesticated camels. Well, lo and behold, they dig and they find some other non-biblical historical documents that have pictures of caravans of people with camels. Are oh, okay, maybe okay, we were wrong on that one. That one was wrong. People did have domesticated camels about 1,000 years earlier than we originally thought. Okay, let's update the history books. Another one is they say, Sodom and Gomorrah was not a real place. There's no historical record of it. Okay, well, in one sense that might be true. Like, there's not like, oh, this was, but there is a city that they have found that we have to dig it up. This stuff's so old. And this is the thing, you got to think, Old Testament, New Testament's a little bit easier, but Old Testament, guys, we're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. The New Testament was 2,000 years ago. The Old Testament is anywhere from 3 to around 6 to 8,000 years, depending on what you're talking about in that area. There's even some argument about that. So a lot of this stuff just deteriorates. You know how many times since I've been here someone said, oh, have you checked out clutter? People get rid of stuff, like things break down, you get rid of it. Hey, I'm going to put this on clutter. Let's get rid of this thing. We throw things away. Things don't last forever, except for our plastic, right? We got to get rid of straws and bags. Other than that, nothing lasts forever. And so a lot of the stuff we don't have because it's just so old and it's deteriorated. But they have been able to find certain things. So they're digging and they're getting down and they find a city and they're like, well, we had a city that, for all intents and purposes, basically worshipped fish. In fact, their city crest was a pregnant woman and in her belly was a fish. Okay, does that kind of sound like, I'm sorry, I'm switching over to Nineveh here now. So there's, that was when Nineveh, the Sodom and Gomorrah one, they've dug up and they found things like, well, there's a city. They begin to describe a bunch of things. And the one that I thought was most interesting for Sodom and Gomorrah is the fact that they said, well, it looks as if not even a nuclear bomb. Like a nuclear bomb wouldn't have been powerful enough. And honestly, what it looks like is a giant meteor, basically, or a bunch of meteor shower just decided this one little spot it was going to just land on and just decimate. Well, that kind of matches up with the biblical account, doesn't it? And so there's little things like that where we begin to find. So, there's stuff like there was Isaiah 20:21 has been refuted for years because they say, screwed up there again. There's a reference to a king that does not exist. We have records of all the kings. That king never existed. Therefore, Isaiah 20:21 is wrong. And so let's question all the Bible, because if this scripture is wrong. Well, then, years later, they find a tomb of this king. And they find all of his inscriptions, they find all the stuff, and they find other lists of kings, and they realize, oh, he actually was a king. And there's lots of stuff like that where this person couldn't have been here, well, there was two of them, or they were the governor for a while, then they lost it, and then they came back and they were like the governor again. That's why their name is in there twice. So there's lots of little things like that that they're discovering and finding are actually true.